Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, produced in cooperation with CKUW-FM Radio in Winnipeg and the Centre for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. And here's your host, Michael Welch.
How has the Canadian Council of Chief Executives influenced federal government policy? Is there a revolving door between Canadian government ministries and elite sectors of the economy? What is the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and what role is it playing in directing Canadian foreign policy? How big a factor is the US in determining Canada's stance on Venezuela and other countries? Is financial security for seniors coming at the expense of the public good? On this week's Global Research News Hour, we probe the agency of Canada's elected politicians and the extent to which unelected entities have taken control of governance of the country. We'll hear from writer and researcher Morgan Duchesney about a group formerly called the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. We'll hear from author Yves Engler about what drives Canadian foreign policy, and we'll hear from Canadian Union of Public Employees Research Officer Kevin Skerrett about how Canadian pension fund investments are fostering privatization of public assets. On this week's program, Canada's secret government. Who is the power behind the throne? Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of June 22nd, 2018. I'm series host and producer Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Centre for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg on occupied Anishinaabe Akin, the homeland of the Métis and the traditional territory of the Nihiawak and the Nakota. We seek to provide you with access to analysis of the major issues shaping our world today from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our program is available from the Centre's website, globalresearch.ca. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. The latest statistics released by the U.S. Treasury Department showed that in April, Russia had only $48.7 billion in American assets, falling all the way to 22nd place on the list of major foreign holders of Treasury securities. Russia sold off $47.4 billion out of the $96.1 billion the country had in U.S. Treasury bonds in March. It sold literally half its holdings of U.S. dollars in just 1 month. That's what happens when you sanction countries. You strategically force them into financially defensive moves. And because a looming trade war has been threatened for some months now, warning shots from China and Japan have also been fired. That comes from the article, U.S. Dollar Sell-Off Continues as Trade Wars Intensify, posted June 22nd, originally appearing at True Publica. Trump's hard-right base imagines hordes of greedy, poorly educated workers eager to steal our well-deserved prosperity. Unfortunately, amidst the justifiable horror evoked by U.S. authorities' criminal treatment of these children, there's too little examination of the conditions that spur many of these mass migrations. Nor is this an accident. U.S. policy has played a major role in fostering or sustaining the violence that impels many to flee. Admitting that role by implication challenges the legitimacy of those policies. That comes from the article, Look Deeper, Child Detention and the U.S.'s Paramilitary Politics Abroad, by Dr. John Buell, posted June 22nd, originally appearing at Informed Comment. Under Trump, 5 bombs are dropped per hour, every hour of every day. That averages out to a bomb every 12 minutes. And which is more outrageous, the crazy amount of death and destruction we are creating around the world, or the fact that your mainstream corporate media basically never investigates it? They talk about Trump's flaws. They say he's a racist, bulbous-headed, self-centered idiot, which is totally accurate, but they don't criticize the perpetual Amityville massacre our military perpetrates by dropping a bomb every 12 minutes, most of them killing 98% non-targets. That comes from the article, Trump's military drops a bomb every 12 minutes and no one is talking about it, by Lee Camp, posted June 21st, originally appearing at Truthdig. As the debate swarms over illegal immigration, Americans on both the left and the right are at each other's throats, pointing fingers over who's responsible. In the meantime, what was a conspiracy theory a month ago is now being confirmed by the very people accused of keeping people in cages. One question, however, has just been raised, which gives one a dark and sickly feeling inside when thinking about the potential answers to it. Where are the girls? There's something particularly disturbing about the minuscule amount of footage recently released by HHS last week. It only shows boys, and only boys aged 10 and up. That comes from the article, Where Are the Girls? Child Trafficking Feared as DHS Can't Say Where Immigrant Girls Are Being Held, by Matt Agorist. Posted June 21st, originally appearing at thefreethoughtproject.com. During his meeting with NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg in Rome, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte pointed out the centrality of the enlarged Mediterranean for European security, now threatened by the arc of instability stretching from the Mediterranean to the Middle East, which is why it is important for NATO, an alliance under U.S. command, which Conte describes as the, quote, pillar of interior and international security, unquote. This is a complete inversion of reality. It is the foundation of USA-NATO strategy, which in fact provoked the arc of instability with its 2 wars against Iraq, the 2 other wars which demolished the states of Yugoslavia and Libya, and the war aimed at demolishing the state of Syria. According to Conte, Italy, which participated in all these wars, plays, quote, a key role for the security and the stability of the southern flank of the alliance, unquote. That comes from the article under the headline, Video, the Circuit of Death in the Enlarged Mediterranean, by Manlio Dinucci, posted June 21st, originally appearing at Il Manifesto. These are just a few of the featured articles appearing last week on the Global Research website. Regular visitors to the site are encouraged to send monetary contributions by fax, mail, or online. Just go to globalresearch.ca and click Donate on the menu bar. We often hear about the American deep state or secret government undermining the will of the electorate and influencing policy in ways that favor for-profit interests. We rarely hear about a Canadian deep state. Are there power players driving the decision-making in Ottawa behind the scenes? One candidate for the role of power behind the throne is the Business Council of Canada, formerly known as the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. While not having much of a public presence, it is reputed to have unparalleled influence over the Prime Minister's office and key members of Parliament. Morgan Duchesney is an Ottawa-based freelance writer and martial arts instructor. His articles appear on the site honeybadgerpress.ca. He's also a frequent contributor to the Victoria Standard. Several years ago, he started researching the CCCE and in 2011 wrote an article, The Canadian Council of Chief Executives, Northern Oligarchy, which examines the influence of this body on Canadian governments, both liberal and conservative. Morgan joins us now by phone. Thank you for joining us, Morgan.
You're welcome.
What can you tell us about the origins of this group?
Well, the Business Council on National Issues, as it was originally called, has its origins in Canada in the early 1980s, as the large number of executives got together under the leadership of a man named Thomas d'Aquino, and they decided that they would organize themselves into a unique corporate lobby group of all of the CEOs of the dominant corporations in Canada, mainly branch plants of U.S. corporations with the stated purpose of having a positive influence on government policy to make Canada more competitive, as they like to say, driving innovation, and this was the idea. And the Prime Minister of the day, Chrétien, publicly bemoaned their power. At the same time that he was, agreeing to often agreeing to do whatever it was they wanted. Yet he publicly bemoaned their influence and how his hands were tied, and in terms of political funding and on and on. They still exist. They've gone through a couple of name changes. They changed later to the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. Now, as you mentioned in your introduction, the Canadian Business Council. But, the idea is the same.
Could you explain what distinguishes them from other corporate lobbyists that have been around since time immemorial?
Well, because they represent the dominant corporations in Canada, they represent what Noam Chomsky would call the people who own the country, who own the businesses, who own the newspapers, the magazines, the television, radio stations, the internet service companies. They have international reach. They employ collectively probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Canadians, in spite of the corporate tax rate dropping dramatically over the last 30 years. They contribute to the tax base. They have global influence, and many of the top actors enjoy what's been called a revolving door privilege, where they shift from the top levels of government back to business, and then it just revolves around and around and around. The Commissioner of Lobbyists has a discretionary power to waive the 5-year cooling off period, and often does.
Well, it's interesting you talk. It's interesting you talk about that revolving door, because the current head of the Business Council is John Manley, a former deputy prime minister under Jean Chrétien.
Oh, yeah.
And you pointed out in a more recent article that former cabinet ministers John McCallum and Joe Oliver had previously held senior positions within the banking and financial sector.
Oh, yes.
And the former Alberta Premier, Jim Prentice, had assumed an executive banking position after leaving.
Almost immediately.
Yeah. How do you
John Baird as well, Harper's foreign minister.
So how do you see that revolving door aspect of political and corporate engagement affecting democracy in Canada?
Well, I've given it a lot of thought, and I think the current state, the reality of the revolving door system, means that we're attracting to political life individuals with a particular ambition, which is less for public service and more for, it seems, personal gain, where, because they know at the end of their political careers, if they don't get a modest pension out of it after 6 years, they will want to go to work, highly paid work, banking on the influence and the insider knowledge that they've developed over their time in office. And so perhaps their behavior in politics is designed to create a favorable impression for those they wish to work for in the future. And I remember asking former Ontario Premier Mike Harris if any of his laws had assisted with his acquiring corporate directorships, and he was angry, and he actually threatened to sue me for libel.
Really?
I said, I'm asking you a question. Could there be a connection? Of course there's a connection. Yes, and that's the problem. So we don't have people who are entering public service, who are running for office, who want to simply serve, without looking to the future. And maybe that means better pensions, better protection for people so they won't have to worry about the future. But the current system seems to attract people who want to who want to make it pay, and pay really well, post-politics.
Seems like a structural flaw in the system.
Yes.
Now, I notice, looking at the board of directors, the current board of directors, one of them is a Paul Desmarais Jr.,
Right.
Who's past chair and sits on the business council. His father, Paul Desmarais of Power Corporation, is reputed to have had direct ties with several high-profile politicians, including former Prime Ministers Trudeau, Chrétien, Mulroney, and Paul Martin.
Oh, definitely.
Do you have any thoughts about whether the Desmarais family and Power Corporation hold some sort of unique influence over Canadian policy?
Well, the fact that they've maintained consistent, close ties with a succession of prime ministers indicates that they must have a consistent level of influence, and the presence of these individuals on these boards is no accident. I know that Paul Martin originally worked for Power Corporation as a young man, and Paul Desmarais Sr. was instrumental in getting him started in the shipping business before he entered politics. It's a favor, and I'm sure Paul Martin didn't forget that. And I suppose that's how it's done. It's a game of, as Chrétien said, in his way, in his fake, folksy way, some guys you know, some guys you don't. And yes, they've maintained consistent ties with a succession of prime ministers, and conversely, you could argue that that's very wise for their business interests, and but the real question for me is why couldn't an ordinary person maintain consistent ties? Why would prime ministers be so interested in maintaining ties with such powerful people, almost exclusively powerful people, even going so far as to marry, have their children, not necessarily arranged marriages, but see that happen. I can't see it as a coincidence. I really don't think so.
Now, Morgan, I know that a few years ago, the government of Jean Chrétien introduced legislation that would eliminate corporate and union donations to political parties. So does the existence of these sorts of lobby groups with their sort of, unique personal and systemic connections with government effectively make such corporate donations and financing to political parties essentially an irrelevant consideration?
Pretty much.
Really?
Yeah, if you can call the prime minister or the industry minister up and say, I'd like to see it tomorrow, and boom, it happens. That's just as good, if not better, than donating $1 million to a campaign with the implied understanding that it's going to buy something. which is never admitted. It can't be admitted. But yes, I'd say it's much more effective. And it does sort of render the donation system not necessarily irrelevant, but much less important. And it provides although it does provide great cover, and it's another systemic or formal mechanism designed to appease, as opposed to really enact any substantive change.
So let's just to nail this, like let's take a group, say like the Sierra Club or the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Right.
In a given year, what would their attempts to message the government, how would they compare with a group like the Business Council of Canada?
Very poorly, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Very poorly. There's no comparison. Maybe a little bit better under Trudeau than it was under Harper. There are no figures available yet, but the access of Sierra Clubs, David Suzuki Foundation, Greenpeace, compared to not just the Canadian Business Council, or the Canadian Council on Business. God, they've changed their names so many times I can't keep it straight. Or the Canadian Petroleum Producers Association. There's no comparison, none at all. I mean, particularly now with the events in Alberta and British Columbia.
Mm.
The Canadian
Yeah.
Petroleum Producers Foundation has tremendous influence, and we see that in the recent deal. Someone was critical of the last article I wrote in the Victoria Standard, where I was talking about the billions of public dollars that are being promised to Kinder Morgan. And this sort of money, it's presented as a loan, or as a Crown Corporation takeover, temporary measure, but the record of repayment of these financial gifts is lousy. It's really, really lousy.
Could you comment on one of the aspects that has been one of the active portfolios of the Business Council of National Issues, or the CCCE, whatever you want to call it, of the council? It's not just promoting business-friendly policies like tax cuts, but promoting neoliberal trade policies, most importantly the so-called free trade agreements.
Yes,
In fact,
these investor rights deals.
Yeah, and
Pacific. They are very, very much they're internationalists. John Manley, by his own admission, is not international. They're continentalists. They see Canada as just, they don't particularly care that much for Canadian sovereignty. They think more of North America as an entity, of course dominated by the Americans, and they would be probably quite happy to allow Canada to continue to abdicate its defense responsibilities to the United States, which incidentally we didn't have to do. At the end of World War II, Canada was a militarily dominant player in the world, and nevertheless, we see what happened. And yes, these investor rights deals, which is essentially what they are, giving foreign corporations the right to sue the Canadian government for damages if they, on our behalf, resist dangerous behavior by foreign corporations, and the Canadian Business Council is front and center on that, driving it, and they were the ones behind NAFTA, and yes, very much continentalists, and thinking of what do they call it? The freedom of capital is more important.
Okay.
Capital mobility being more important than human mobility.
In that case, when you hear the Prime Minister saying that we're going to purchase this Kinder Morgan pipeline because it's in the national interest,
Right.
and yet the Business Council is saying that, well, you're effectively saying that they're putting investor rights over, what most of us are accustomed to thinking of as the national interest.
Right.
What do you make sense of those two propositions? This pipeline's in the national interest, but you've got a group lobbying that doesn't really care all that much about what we think of as the national interest.
Well, it's just talk.
Yeah.
It's just code. When they say that, it's done to play on the heartstrings of Canadians. It's not something that they really believe. And Kinder Morgan itself is not a particularly successful organization. They've had a lot of problems in the past, and they've been linked to Enron, and everyone knows that story. And the money, it's public money. It is not government money. It really annoys me when I hear, people, so-called professional journalists talking about government funding or government money, because it isn't. There is no such thing as government money. It's all public money. And so this project is being funded by the people of Canada. And
Since
talk of national interest is code.
Since you brought up the media reporting, have you noticed changes in the way the media have been reporting on national stories since this Business Council came into being?
Well, the Business Council doesn't really get a lot of press, and I think they like it that way. Every so often you will see an interview with John Manley, actually a little bit more over the last couple of years, but prior to that you would see it in publications like the Report on Business or the financial pages of the Globe and Mail, but there wasn't a lot of front page general news coverage about the Business Council. Although John Manley was well known. He's a bit smoother than his predecessor, Duchesney. He was known to be a bit abrasive and a bit more blunt. Manley, having been a politician, I think, is a much smoother operator. And it's, at least in the corporate media, what I call the corporate media, when you see comments by men like John Manley, it's offered with very little context, and rarely with any really articulate counterpoint. It's offered as though his comments are a foregone conclusion, the highest state of rational thinking, because he is who he is and he represents who he does, and it's almost a function of the authority bias. People, even though many people are very, very critical of government, yet they also have a real deference to authority and the opinions of authority, even in the face of contradictory evidence. So that's my take on that.
Okay. Well, I think we've got to leave it there, Morgan, but
Sure.
I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share these
you're welcome.
perspectives with our listeners.
I hope it was helpful.
We've been speaking with Morgan Duchesney, Ottawa-based freelance writer and martial arts instructor. His articles appear on the site honeybadgerpress.ca. You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcast out of Winnipeg on campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. We are also podcast on the website globalresearch.ca. Who's calling the shots on Canadian foreign policy on mining, militarism, and so-called humanitarian interventions? One key voice to address these questions to is a frequent guest, Yves Engler. Yves Engler is a Montreal-based political activist and writer specializing in dissident perspectives on Canadian foreign policy. He's been referred to as Canada's Noam Chomsky and has authored close to a dozen books over the past decade and a half, including his 2016 book, A Propaganda System: How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation, published by Fernwood. Welcome back to the show, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've written about a powerful player known as the Canadian Global Affairs Institute as a key mechanism for pushing foreign policy into a hawkish direction. What can you share with our listeners about who makes up this group and how it came into being?
Well, the Canadian Global Affairs Institute is a Calgary-based think tank. It changed its name a couple years ago, but it's basically a pro-military, pro-corporate think tank set up largely with money from Frederick Mannix, who is I believe, billionaire, if not a billionaire, close to a billionaire in Calgary. That's a staunch militarist, somebody who has he has a number of been an honorary colonel, a number of different regiments, and he basically its board of directors has people from IM Gold, a major Canadian mining company that's operated abroad. It's received funding from a number of different military companies like General Dynamics, Lockheed. It's received some funding from the Canadian Military's Security Defense Forum, or at least some of its people have received funding from the Security Defense Forum. And, it's one important voice in pushing the popular discussion in this country in the direction of militarism, in the direction of pro-NATO, pro-Western, pro-corporate Canadian foreign policy.
So who does the CGAI target beyond politicians?
It focuses mostly on produce the standard things of what think tanks do, which is producing reports, writing op-eds for media outlets, but also it's operated I guess you could call it kind of like a media flak operations, where they put pressure on journalists that they didn't feel were sufficiently supportive of the military. And David Puglisi, who's the defense reporter at the Ottawa Citizen, tells a story about receiving flack, and his editors receiving flack from folks at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute over some of his writing. But they also, the Canadian Global Affairs Institute runs a program with a military studies department at the University of Calgary to train journalists in covering the Canadian military. And the objective of the program is to basically have the journalists see the military in a better light. So it's that's a kind of a project that's not really about short-term aims of getting a certain idea into the media, but a more longer-term objective of shaping journalists' relationship to the Canadian military, and obviously in a direction that's a more sympathetic to the military. Certainly not in a direction that the peace movement might want journalists to go.
Do you see were there any trigger events in Canadian political life that might have forced this CGAI or whatever its predecessor was to boost its presence?
kind of left unstated in a lot of this stuff is that for decades and decades, the military was it's just nothing but positive press. And I think that the late 60s into the 70s, the anti-war movement around Vietnam, and then the peace movements of the later 70s and 80s, I think that sort of have some effect. And then the scandal in Somalia, that started weakening the military's sort of grip over public consciousness. And Frederick Mannix is part of a number of initiatives that he's launched that were partly, I think, kind of a response to the military sort of losing a little bit of its luster. But still, through these times when we talk about the death of the Canadian military, there's still the major source of federal government funding is the biggest budget item line is the military, and still it's still a very powerful institution and with a massive budget, etc.
Now, are there other institutions that you see as being instrumental in driving Canadian policy in a more hawkish direction?
Yeah, I mean, the Security Defense Forum, which is a program that exists at I think its high point of 15 different Canadian universities, security studies programs were receiving funding. Security Defense Forum is a military body that designed to set up 4 decades ago to fund university programs to promote security studies, which overwhelmingly are pro-military type of thinking. And so that's an important body in terms of militarist kind of thinking. If you just take a look at, take Barrick Gold, the biggest gold mining company in the world, Canada's biggest mining company. If you look at their public relations budget department, it dwarfs all of the public relations or all of the people being paid to engage in mining justice work, for instance. So the group like Mining Watch Canada, I think, has 3 or 4 employees. Barrick Gold's public relations department's much bigger than that. Mining Association of Canada, Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. These groups have much more money to spend on promoting Canadian global mining, and then there's 1,000 or maybe into thousands of individual smaller mining companies that usually have one person, or in some cases like a gold corps, not a big Vancouver-based mining company. Many people working in public relations and lobbying. If you take a look at the lobbying records at Parliament Hill, lobbyists are supposed to register when they meet with politicians or their staff, and you'll find that these mining companies have many visits to meeting the politicians. You go into, whereas again, like the mining solidarity movements, it's mostly volunteer works. There's a few people paid across the country to do that work, but it's overwhelmingly volunteer. You go into a different domain. You look at the question of Palestine. You'll find that the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, the main Israel lobbying organization in the country, they meet regularly with politicians. They regularly bring MPs of all parties to all expenses paid trips to Israel, and they show them a pro-Israel kind of perspective. So when you start digging into the different domains of Canadian foreign policy, you find that the big companies, the mining companies, the military companies, and others have infinitely more resources to fund think tanks, to fund lobbying efforts, to fund public relations. And then on top of that, of course, is that the whole media sphere, the dominant media is structured in a way to sort of serve power, and that power, is generally finds itself in corporate back offices, in the Canadian military. The Canadian military, of course, we should have said this already. The Canadian military is the largest PR department of any institution in this country. It's hundreds and hundreds. One estimate 660 people, I think it was, engaged in public relations for the Canadian military. I mean, the peace movement probably has one person or two people paid to engage in this kind of work. So it's the scales are very much in favor of the pro-militarist, pro-corporate perspective.
And I guess maybe just one last question I'd like to put to you. There's a tendency among a lot of people, including on the left, that a lot of the pressure on Canadian politicians is coming from the United States, a very hawkish nation and militaristic. To what extent do these organizations yield to U.S.-centric interests versus indigenous when I say indigenous, I mean like Canadian corporate interests, if you will?
Yeah, very rarely do they yield to indigenous as an indigenous people interest.
And that's not what I meant by indigenous.
It depends. I think you got to look at different sectors. Okay, with regards to the mining sector. A very important part of Canadian foreign policy is advancing the interests of Canadian mining companies in Africa, Latin America, heavily, a little bit less so in Asia. In that case, I mean, yes, the U.S. is the center of the capitalist world, and in a sense, it promotes the general capitalist interests around the world. But really, in the case of the mining, this is an entirely or an overwhelmingly Canadian-centered process. This is not about serving American mining interests. This is about serving Canadian mining interests, and Canadian corporations and wealthy Canadians are heavily invested in the mining sector, and they are far and away the world's dominant player. So that's an area where I would say it's almost nothing to do with U.S. power, U.S. lobbying. I think the military sector is more closely tied in with sort of U.S. power and the U.S. Military. I think that the U.S. does put pressure on Canada to increase military spending, and the Canadian military companies are very much tied into U.S. military companies. And the Canadian military itself, most of the recent chiefs of the defense staff have been trained. Have trained in the U.S. and have fairly close ties to their American counterparts. So I think the military would be an area where the sort of U.S. influence is real. It's there. The question of Palestine, the question of Israel, that's also one that there is some U.S. influence. Obviously, U.S. is a staunch pro-Israel country, has a big impact on worldwide support for Israel. But then again, there's also domestic forces that are pushing in that direction. So I think it varies. You take a look at like recent months. Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister, has been staunchly opposed to the government in Venezuela, and has just been campaigning aggressively, over the top, pushing Caribbean countries to take a more anti-Venezuela position during bilateral discussions. The simplistic analysis that some say is, this is just Chrystia Freeland that wants to make nice with Trump because to help in negotiations with NAFTA. I don't think that that's non-existent as a factor, but I think the fact that the whole Canadian mining sector is hostile to what they call resource nationalism, which is countries basically trying to get a bit more of the wealth being created from their natural resources. The fact that Venezuela has been viewed as at the sort of forefront of more nationalistic natural resource policy, I think that is also an important factor in explaining Chrystia Freeland's aggressiveness to the government of Venezuela. So, I think each issue is there's slight differences on each one of them. Yes, U.S. policy is important, but I think also it's important to be aware that there's a whole sector of even progressive progressive opinion in this country that tries to sort of blame it all on the U.S. The U.S. has forced us to do these bad things, and it's actually, I think, a bit more complicated than that.
We've been speaking with Yves Engler, Montreal-based political activist and writer. You can find his articles at the website yvesengler.com. The Canadian Pension Plan is considered a progressive initiative, making sure that for Canadians, retirement does not mean destitution. However, the CPP Investment Board funds projects that offer the best return on investment, regardless of social or environmental implications. Beyond this reality, pension funds generally are assisting in the privatization of a whole range of infrastructure projects, which has consequences for the public good. Joining us to discuss this subject is Kevin Skerrett. He's a research officer with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. He's co-editor and contributor to the volume The Contradictions of Pension Fund Capitalism, published by Cornell Press. He also authored an article for Canadian Dimension back in January. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
A lot of Canadians might be outraged to hear that their pension funds are invested in oil pipelines, weapons manufacturers, and other areas, and they have no choice in the matter. You can't opt out of the CPP and invest in, say, more ethical ventures even if you wanted to. But it seems that there's something unique about the way Canadian pension funds are utilized to advance infrastructure projects. What's the link between pension fund investing and privatization of infrastructure projects?
Yes, it's an excellent question. And as you say, in this book that I was recently a part of pulling together, I have a whole chapter dedicated to this phenomenon, which I think a lot of Canadians and a lot of pension plan members, not just Canada Pension Plan, but also workplace level pension plans, and may not be aware of actually, what their pension funds are doing. These plans have been increasingly structured to connect the pension benefit promises to financial assets in the private financial markets. And what my recent research has looked more deeply at is just exactly what does that mean. And in over the last 20 years, the argument I'm developing is that Canada's pension funds, even more so than those of other countries, have become very deeply implicated in this particular direction of investing in what used to be public infrastructure, and it has been a part of a wave of really the privatization of many different forms of public infrastructure, not just roads and bridges and some of that physical infrastructure, but also vital parts of the public sector, water systems and hospital systems and schools and many other things that a lot of Canadians and certainly a lot of public sector workers believe should be publicly owned and controlled and democratically managed. So the connection there is an important one, and the reason the funds are doing it is because they're finding attractive investment opportunities through the results of neoliberal privatization of these various things. So there's a troubling connection here that I think needs more debate.
Hence the contradiction.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, if I'm understanding properly, when you have this courting of pension fund money, are we talking about somehow be directing it in a way that it'll somehow create more investment from other sources, not just pension funds? Like priming the pump, so to speak?
I think that is. I mean, I think the actual mechanics of this investment can play out in different ways. Sometimes pension funds are one institutional source of investment alongside a number of others, and they can be relatively small or passive investors that are just joining the crowd. But the thing that I'm signaling, and the work that I've been recently publishing on, is showing that in certain cases, in fact many cases, pension funds, and including these large Canadian funds like CPPIB, are actually playing a leading role in directly investing in these things. That means on a private equity or direct ownership basis, they are buying up companies, they're buying up entities and projects and chunks of physical infrastructure, not just in Canada, but in other countries, including in the global south, in a way that is really, transforming the pension funds themselves into like businesses, like business operations, where they're going to own and operate chunks of physical infrastructure on a very peculiar for-profit basis, but for-profit, but also on an untaxed basis. Pension funds are tax-exempt entities, so they're developing a very peculiar private business model where they are, serving a function like a private company would, but they don't pay taxes on it, and it is having the same kind of predatory, socially regressive impact of all kinds of the privatizations that we've seen, but it is being given a gloss, like a relatively positive appearance, because a lot of people have positive associations with pension funds. Well, if the pension funds are involved, it must be somehow socially positive, and I think there's a lot of myths and illusions that people have that we've got to overcome.
And yeah, this goes along, I mean, for people who are critical of ownership of the means of production, well, in a sense, I mean, here you have these people who, through their pension funds, becoming owners of these private operations. I mean, you made a comparison between the Ontario Teachers Plan support for a privatized water utility in Chile, while there's not the same degree of investment in water infrastructure for First Nations reserves. Does the requirement of the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board having to get the best possible return on investment effectively dictate the kind of public works projects the Canadian government will have to support?
I think, I mean, that zeroes right in on a key issue here, and that is, when we talk about public infrastructure, what we should be thinking about, and what historically people fought for, going back to the 19th century, was having a certain category of goods that are recognized as being important, socially important, and even important for the economy, that the state, that government, and the public sector take responsibility for, pull it out of the private market so that it not become monopolized and can be actually part of social and economic development that can be state-led. Well, as you know, as people are familiar with, over the last 30, 40 years, what we crudely call the neoliberal revolution of Thatcher and Reagan and others, have basically said, look, we're going to turn against that model and actually push a whole range of these things back into the private market. And in many cases, what this is producing is private monopolies that are transforming what were public goods into private for-profit opportunities. And one of the arguments I'm making about this, because what this is really doing is financial, it's not just privatizing, but it's financializing these public goods. The pension funds as entities, as kind of corporate business sector entities, are not just taking up opportunities that governments are providing when they privatize. They are actually becoming political actors that are lobbying and pressing and organizing governments to change public policy to produce more of these things, to actually privatize more, produce more public-private partnerships, more investment opportunities for them. So this is not just a passive role. They are actually agents, like political agents of this. They get involved in lobbying exercises. They They work together, sometimes with private banks and other parts of the financial system, to actually make more of these opportunities happen. And a lot of this is happening, in ways that are not very visible to the broad population and certainly the pension plan members. It's done very quietly. And I think this is a really troubling trajectory that we need to politicize. We need more people to understand this dynamic, and we need to actually figure out a way to push against this whole direction, because I think that what we're really talking about now, the entire public sector and public infrastructure is sort of on the table under threat. And I think this is, ironically, this is a threat not just to some of the fabric of our society, but it's actually in some ways a direct threat to, the existing workers in the public sector, including the members of the pension funds that are carrying this out. So this is where the contradictions become really stark, and something to really we need to figure out how to discuss and how to challenge.
The Trudeau government announced just a couple of weeks ago it would indemnify investors taking over the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. And the CPP-IB board CEO Mark Mackin signaled that the CPP was on board, and that'll come as a shock to a lot of those pipeline protesters on the West Coast. But what's the significance of the CPP rallying behind that project in the wider context you just mentioned?
This pipeline is perhaps the single most contentious infrastructural project that we've seen in recent years, and contentious for all the reasons we know, the climate change, ecologically destructive aspect. We've got Indigenous First Nations land rights at stake. There's all kinds of reasons that a lot of people are opposed to this project, and we kind of see provincial and the federal government trying to jam this through notwithstanding. So to see the Canada Pension Plan and possibly other pension funds being potentially tapped or mobilized to actually invest and help make this happen is actually a really troubling divergence from I would say the long-established tradition of seeing the CPP Investment Board as a pure financial actor, not an arm or agent of the federal government, but making financial decisions separate. So that is potentially troubling if this is politicizing that board. But then the second piece of this is, if the government is going to indemnify and actually create a situation where investing in this project is no risk, it's essentially indemnified, you can have an attractive rate of return with essentially no risk, then of course these pension funds, as rational profit maximizers, they're going to take up the opportunity. But then that begs deep questions about, like, what is this, and what kind of disastrous public policy is this federal government getting us drawn into, where not only are we having all of the negative downsides of this pipeline project, but we're also having to see the federal treasury, the federal budget, being tapped to subsidize and indemnify the private investors that are wanting to take advantage of this opportunity as a simple money-making exercise. So this is giving us a window into a really troubling kind of combination of public policies that I think really need far more debate and scrutiny, and we need to figure out a way to reorient not only away from fossil fuels and pipelines, but also away from having major infrastructure decisions simply being made by, as I say, profit-maximizing financial players.
Kevin Skerrett is a research officer with the Canadian Union of Public Employees and co-editor of The Contradictions of Pension Fund Capitalism, published by Cornell Press. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can listen to our programs every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States. You can also download each episode from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. I'm series host, creator, and producer Michael Welch. Join us again next week.